What would you do if the people you trusted most tried to poison you at your own family dinner? That's not the plot of a thriller movie. That was my reality. I am Arthur Bennett, 68 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is not just a family story. It's a family betrayal, a dark inheritance drama, and perhaps the most chilling revenge story you'll hear this year. After years of silence, my son Michael invited me to dinner at his mansion in Montclair, New Jersey. He said it was a chance to make things right. For a moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that blood was still thicker than greed. But before the night was over, I would learn the truth. In my own family, trust had become a weapon. The mansion glowed with chandeliers and polished marble floors, a world away from the modest garage business I built with my own hands. Michael stood tall, dressed sharp, with a smile that felt rehearsed. His wife Sophia floated in like a queen, her silk dress glittering under the lights. They welcomed me warmly, perhaps too warmly. I told myself it was nerves, that after years of distance, we were all trying too hard. But when I sat down at the table, smoothing my old navy suit, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I slipped it out quietly. The words on the glowing screen froze my blood. Stand up. Leave now. Don't tell your son. I stared at the message as the chandelier above us hummed faintly. My pulse hammered in my ears. Who would send this? Why tonight? My first thought was a prank, some cruel mistake. But the phone buzzed again, and suddenly the roast beef, the crystal glasses, the polite laughter, all of it looked different. The table was no longer a place for reconciliation. It was a stage, and I was the target. I looked at Michael's smile, just a little too eager, his eyes darting quickly toward the head of the table, where the papers sat under a linen napkin. I looked at Sophia, her hand lingering on my arm just a second too long, her perfume heavy, almost suffocating. Outwardly, it was the perfect family dinner. Inwardly, it was a trap. And somewhere inside this house, someone wanted me alive, alive enough to warn me. That night would become more than just a dinner. It would become the unraveling of every secret, every wound, every hunger that had been hiding inside my family. This was not reconciliation. This was an ambush. And the message that saved my life was only the beginning. The dining room shimmered like something out of a magazine spread. The mahogany table stretched long beneath the glittering chandelier, every place setting arranged with military precision, silver knives, gleaming crystal glasses aligned like soldiers ready for inspection. Michael laughed too loudly at some small joke, his voice bouncing off the marble floor, while Sophia moved with flawless grace, her silk dress rustling softly as she placed the roast beef in front of me. To anyone else, it might have looked like a portrait of family harmony, the kind of evening you'd post on social media to prove that everything was perfect. But I knew better, and the message on my phone kept burning in my mind. Stand up. Leave now. Don't tell your son. I forced myself to smile, to nod politely, but my hands trembled just enough that I had to keep them locked around my napkin. Michael poured wine into my glass, the red liquid catching the chandelier light like fresh blood. Dad, you'll love this, he said warmly, his eyes locking on mine just a little too long. His words sounded affectionate, but his tone was rehearsed. I had raised this boy, I knew his tells, and this smile of his wasn't love. It was calculation. Sophia leaned closer, her perfume heavy, almost suffocating. Arthur, you look wonderful tonight. Margaret would be proud, she said softly. The mention of my late wife sent a chill through me. Using her name at this table felt like sacrilege, as if they wanted to manipulate me with her memory. I managed a small nod, unwilling to give away how much it stung. When I lifted the whiskey glass Michael had poured earlier, something caught my eye. Under the warm amber surface, faint particles swirled slowly like dust trapped in honey. At first I thought it might be the glass, maybe residue from ice. But no, this was different. Tiny grains that didn't belong. My throat went dry. That was when my phone buzzed again in my pocket. I shifted slightly, pulling it out under the tablecloth, pretending to adjust my napkin. The screen glowed. The drink is not safe. Watch carefully. Don't sign anything tonight. I nearly dropped the phone. My pulse thudded in my ears louder than the clinking of silverware. I looked at the glass again. Michael's own drink was already half finished, his smile wide, his laugh too bright. But mine sat untouched, glistening under the chandelier like a trap. He noticed, of course. His eyes flicked toward the glass, then back at me quick as lightning. Go ahead, Dad. It's the good stuff. 20 years aged, nothing but the best for you. His words were wrapped in charm, but I could hear the pressure underneath. Sophia reached across the table, her manicured hand brushing mine as she nudged the glass closer. Just a sip, Arthur, she said tenderly, like a command disguised as kindness. Her eyes sparkled, but not with warmth, with urgency. I set the glass aside, forcing a chuckle. Maybe later. I want to savor it. My voice sounded calm, but inside my chest burned. Michael's smile faltered just slightly, then returned wider than before. Sophia's lips tightened for a fraction of a second before she let out a practiced laugh. The air in the room felt heavier, like the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Every laugh, every glance, every polite word had edges now sharp and dangerous. I answered when spoken to, I nodded when required, but inside my mind was racing. Someone in this house was watching me, warning me, trying to keep me alive. And the people sitting across from me, the son I had raised, and the woman who had sworn to stand by him, were trying to kill me. The roast beef on my plate tasted like ashes. I chewed slowly, forcing it down while Michael drummed his fingers lightly on the polished table. A nervous habit he'd had since childhood, back when he was 10 years old and swore he hadn't broken the neighbor's window, even though the baseball was still in his hand. That same restless drumming was here now, except the stakes weren't a broken pane of glass. The stakes were my life. I reached for my water instead of the whiskey, taking a long, steady sip. The cool liquid calmed the fire in my chest, if only for a moment. Across the table, Sophia tilted her head, her smile stretching too thin. Michael leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the polished wood. Dad, he said, his tone too casual. We really want tonight to be special. We've wasted too much time. It's time to start thinking about the future. The word future landed on the table like a hammer. My mind returned to the warning, don't sign anything tonight. I glanced at the corner of the table, where a stack of papers lay half hidden beneath a linen napkin. Not menus, not decoration, documents. And suddenly the entire evening snapped into focus. This wasn't reconciliation. This wasn't dinner. This was theater. And the act they wanted me to play was the role of a dying old man, ready to hand over everything he had built. But I wasn't going to give them that performance, not tonight. Michael's voice carried across the table, warm and inviting, as if he were delivering a speech he had practiced in front of a mirror. Dad, he said, lifting his glass, we've been thinking a lot about legacy, about what it means to keep the family strong. You've built so much, and it's time we start planning for the future. The word legacy should have felt comforting, but instead it scraped against my nerves. Sophia's smile spread wide, polished and perfect, the kind of smile that photographers capture on magazine covers. She leaned slightly toward me, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light. For a fleeting second, she looked less like a daughter-in-law and more like an heir posing with her prize. I nodded slowly, keeping my face neutral. On the surface, it might have looked like reconciliation. A family reunited after years of silence. Michael's tone was gentle, Sophia's laughter smooth, and the table itself was laid out like a celebration of forgiveness. But beneath it all, I felt the rot. Every word was scripted, every glance rehearsed, every laugh just a beat too late or too loud. It wasn't a reunion. It was a performance. Michael tapped his fingers lightly on the polished mahogany, a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. You know, Dad, he continued, those 7 garages across Queens and Brooklyn, they're more than just businesses. They're part of who we are. People respect the Bennett name because of them, and we want to make sure they keep thriving. His words should have filled me with pride. But the way he said, we made my stomach tighten. This wasn't admiration, it was ownership. Sophia leaned forward, resting her chin delicately on her hand. Which one is doing best, Arthur? She asked sweetly. Is it the one in Astoria, or maybe the one near Brooklyn Heights? You must know which property holds the most value. She said the word value as though she were talking about stocks or jewelry, not the grease-stained shops where I had spent decades of my life. I thought of Margaret then, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee late at night, as she whispered encouragements telling me that sweat and discipline would keep us afloat. I had built those garages, one wrench, one customer, one honest handshake at a time. and now my son and his wife reduced them to numbers on a balance sheet. I gave a vague answer, forcing a small smile. They all do fine, I said, my voice steady. Each one has something Margaret left in it, her touch, her advice. They're built on more than numbers. Sophia's smile tightened, though she quickly masked it with a sip of wine. Michael chuckled softly, but the sound was hollow. Sentiment's nice, Dad, he said, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Business is about margins, expansion, growth. You taught me that. I looked at him closely, then really looked. His tailored suit, his slicked back hair, the mansion surrounding him, all of it screamed success. But underneath, I saw the same restless boy who had always chased shortcuts, who always wanted applause without effort. Except now the stakes were in a broken window or an unpaid debt. Now the stakes were everything I had built, everything Margaret and I had sacrificed for. Outwardly, the scene remained flawless. Sophia's laughter rang like music. Michael's voice softened with false affection, and the clinking of silverware filled the air. To an outsider, it would have looked like a family healed, but to me it was transparent. The questions weren't born of curiosity. They were born of hunger. Their smiles weren't genuine. They were sharpened into tools, each word pushing me closer to a signature that would erase my life's work. I glanced at my whiskey glass, still untouched. The particles at the bottom shimmered faintly under the light, like a warning only I could see. My hand brushed against Margaret's pocket watch in my vest pocket, the steady tick grounding me. I remembered her words again. Arthur, don't let him ruin himself by chasing easy roads. And as Michael and Sophia carried on their scripted dialogue, I realized this dinner wasn't about healing wounds. It was about digging new ones. On the surface, everything was beautiful, but beneath the shine, betrayal sat coiled, waiting for me to take one sip, one stroke of the pen, one moment of weakness. And I knew then that this was no family reunion. This was the opening act of an ambush. I stepped out into the hallway, the sound of silverware and polite conversation fading behind me until it became nothing more than a distant hum. The air out here was cooler, clearer, and yet it carried a weight of its own. My hand slipped into my vest pocket almost by instinct, brushing against the familiar brass of Margaret's pocket watch. I pulled it out gently, holding it in my palm. The surface was worn smooth from years of my thumb, tracing it absent-mindedly, and as I wound it once, the tiny gears clicked to life. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was steady, patient like a heartbeat, that wasn't mine, grounding me when everything else threatened to spin out of control. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the tick carry me back to the beginning, to the days when my shirts were stiff with grease stains, when my hands were raw from turning wrenches until midnight, when every dollar I earned went straight into a jar on the kitchen counter. Margaret would sit across from me at that tiny table in our first apartment, her hair pulled back, a pencil tucked behind her ear as she scribbled numbers into a notebook. She kept our budget tighter than a drum, stretching pennies into meals, never complaining, always encouraging. I could see her now, her smile faint but steady as she whispered, "Arthur, don't let shortcuts ruin it. We build slow, we build honest, and it will last." Those words had been our compass. Every time I was tempted to take an easier path, every time someone dangled fast money in front of me, Margaret's voice pulled me back. And she was right. It took us years to save enough for a down payment on our first home, years of sweat, sacrifice, and nights spent patching my only pair of work boots instead of buying new ones. But when we finally turned the key to that little house, when we stood in the doorway, knowing it was ours, the pride in her eyes was worth every hardship. The memory shifted, pulling me further forward. I saw Michael as a boy barely 10, his face smeared with grease, as he tried to hand me a wrench in the garage. He wanted so badly to impress me back then. I guided his small hand, showing him how to tighten a bolt properly, how to listen to the rhythm of an engine to know what was wrong. For a moment, I believed he would inherit not just my business, but my patience, my discipline, my respect for hard work. But even then, there were signs. The restless drumming of his fingers, the way his eyes darted to the clock, eager for the task to be done, so he could run off to something else. The shortcuts began, small, unfinished chores, excuses about homework, lies about broken windows. Margaret would smooth my anger, whispering, "He's just a boy, Arthur. He'll grow out of it." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe time and love would guide him. Yet here I was, decades later, standing in a mansion that wasn't built by discipline or sweat, but by schemes I didn't yet fully understand. The suit on Michael's back, the polished table, the wine poured with such elegance, they were all shortcuts dressed up as success. And the worst part was he didn't even see it. He still believed shortcuts could carry him through, even if it meant poisoning his own father to get there. The watch ticked steadily in my hand, each beat a reminder of the path Margaret and I had chosen. Honest work, slow building, sacrifice for something that would endure. I pressed the watch to my chest, feeling its pulse against my heart. For a moment it felt like Margaret was beside me again, her hand on my shoulder steadying me. I opened my eyes, staring at the hallway lined with oil paintings and marble statues that didn't belong to Michael, not really. They were props, rented illusions of wealth meant to convince the world he had built something of his own. But I knew the truth, and deep down so did he. The tick of the watch grew louder in the silence. It was as if Margaret herself was speaking again, her words sharper now, cutting through the fog of memory. Arthur, don't let him ruin himself. Don't let him drag you down with him. Remember who you are. Remember what we built. I clenched the watch tightly, my knuckles white. For the first time that night, clarity replaced fear. The son I had hoped would carry my legacy had chosen a different path, a darker one. And no matter how polished the facade, no matter how sweet the words spoken at that table, I could see it for what it was. A performance, a trap, a shortcut that would destroy him and maybe me if I allowed it. I slipped the watch back into my vest pocket, straightened my tie, and drew a long breath. The performance might still be going on in that dining room, but I wasn't the audience anymore. I was a player, and I had Margaret's voice guiding me still. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was steady, and so was I. The murmur of conversation faded as I slipped quietly down the hallway, my footsteps muted against the marble floor. I paused by the kitchen door, my chest tightening as I heard the faint clink of glassware, the gentle rush of running water. It was a stark contrast to the laughter echoing from the dining room. I pushed the door open slowly, and the scent of roasted meat mingled with the sharp sweetness of caramelized sugar. Elena Morales stood at the sink, her back to me, her shoulders tense as she dried a glass with deliberate precision. She looked up just briefly when she heard the door creak, her eyes darting to the hallway behind me, before settling on mine. Mr. Bennett, she whispered, her accent softening my name. Her lips barely moved, but her gaze was sharp, urgent. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to match hers. Elena, I said quietly, is everything all right? Her hands trembled as she set the glass down, the faintest clink, betraying the nerve she worked so hard to hide. She leaned in slightly, her voice no louder than a breath. They put something in your drink. Tonight they want your signature. Power of attorney. Don't sign. The words struck me like a hammer. I had suspected, I had feared, but hearing them aloud tore away the last thread of denial. My throat tightened. How do you know this? I asked, my voice barely audible. I clean, she said simply, her eyes glistening. I hear, I see. They talk like I am not here, like I am furniture. They forget I understand. My hand instinctively went to my vest pocket, pressing against Margaret's pocket watch, as if the ticking could steady me. And Elena's eyes flicked downward, noticing the gesture, then quickly back to the doorway. Her voice quickened. They said if you sign, you will forget tomorrow. They will take control. All of it. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The mansion, the roast, the polished silver, it was all a stage set for my destruction. But before I could respond, Elena's hand shot to her apron pocket. She pulled out a small object, wrapped in a folded napkin, and pressed it into my palm. Take this, she urged. I unwrapped it just enough to see the metallic glint of a USB drive. My pulse quickened. What is this proof, she whispered. Emails, contracts, plans. They printed everything this week. I copied when no one looked. Enough to show intent. For a moment I could only stare at her, stunned. This woman, overlooked, dismissed, treated like background, had risked everything to become my ally. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. Elena, if they catch you, they already think I am invisible. She interrupted, her chin lifting slightly, strength flashing in her eyes. That is my protection. Invisible people see everything. I slipped the USB into my vest pocket, tucking it beside the pocket watch. 2 anchors, one of love, one of survival. My chest tightened with a mix of gratitude and dread. You've done more than I could ever ask, I whispered. Her expression softened, but the fear never left her eyes. She turned back to the sink, running water over her hands as footsteps echoed faintly down the hall. Sophia's voice floated closer, light and sharp like glass about to shatter. Elena's grip on my arm was sudden, urgent. Say nothing, please, for both of us. I nodded just as Sophia appeared in the doorway, her smile as radiant as ever. Arthur, she sang, her tone perfectly measured, everything all right. Perfect, I said, smoothly slipping the napkin back into my pocket. Elena was just telling me about the dessert. Lovely work. Sophia's gaze lingered on me, her eyes searching, but her smile never faltered. After a beat, she looped her arm through mine and guided me back toward the dining room. Good, then let's return. Michael is eager to continue. As I glanced back over my shoulder, I caught a final glimpse of Elena. She stood motionless by the sink, her eyes locked on mine. Fear shimmered there. Yes, but so did something else, a promise. She had given me more than a warning. She had given me the first weapon in this battle. Back at the table, the silverware gleamed, the chandelier sparkled, and the whiskey glass still sat untouched at my elbow. But inside my pocket, the USB pressed against the pocket watch, and for the first time that night, I felt the faintest flicker of strength. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone. I had proof, and I had an ally. Back at the table, I forced myself to sit straighter, to smooth my napkin across my lap as though nothing were wrong. The paper sat near Michael's elbow, half concealed under a folded napkin, their notary seal glimmering faintly in the chandelier's light. Every few minutes, he nudged them closer, his smile tightening when I deliberately pushed them away with a casual laugh. Later, I'd say lightly, dessert first. I let the minutes drag, drawing out every toast, every story, pretending to be the indulgent old man they thought I was. But inside, the warning burned. Don't sign anything tonight. When I finally stepped back into the night air, the mansion's glowing windows at my back, I exhaled for the first time in hours. The ride back to Queens was silent, the city lights blurring past. In my vest pocket, the USB pressed firmly against Margaret's pocket watch. 2 anchors, one to remind me who I was, one to prove what they had tried to do. By the time I arrived at my office above the garage, the plan was already forming. The office smelled of oil and dust, familiar and grounding. I sat heavily at my desk, pulled out the USB, and called Richard Coleman. He had been my lawyer for over 20 years, a friend who had seen me through contracts, disputes, and the worst days of Margaret's illness. His voice, though groggy with the late hour, sharpened when he heard the tremor in mine. I told him everything, slowly, carefully, like laying out tools on a workbench. The dinner invitation, the poisoned drink, the stack of papers, and finally the warning Elena had whispered in the kitchen. Richard arrived the next morning, his briefcase clutched like a weapon. I plugged the USB into my old desktop, and together we watched the folders bloom across the screen. There they were, forged drafts of my signature email threads between Michael and Sophia, discussing sedatives, timing, and succession. Richard's jaw clenched as he read. Arthur, he said gravely, this isn't just attempted fraud. This is conspiracy, and with this evidence, they're finished. For days, we worked carefully, making copies of every file, printing the most damning pages, storing backups in safe places. Richard insisted we move deliberately, lining up the district attorney before confronting Michael. But fate doesn't wait for convenience. It was only 3 nights later when Michael appeared at my garage office unannounced. He walked in like he still belonged there, but his suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, his eyes bloodshot. He shut the door behind him, his smile faltering almost immediately. Dad, he started, his voice half pleading, half commanding. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands calmly over Margaret's watch. Then talk. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the stack of papers on my desk, the very ones I had printed from the USB. His face paled. Where did you, from your own house, I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. From your desk, don't insult me by pretending you don't know what these are. His lips trembled, the mask slipping. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Sophia pushed too hard. I just needed time. Time for what I asked coldly. For the loans, he blurted, his composure cracking. For the people who, he stopped himself, but it was too late. His fist clenched, his shoulders sagged. Finally, the boy I once knew showed through the man's polished veneer, desperate, reckless, trapped. I rose slowly, my eyes never leaving his. You could have asked for help. You could have told me the truth. But instead you tried to drug me, to steal what your mother and I built with our lives. His breathing quickened, his hands shaking. Dad, please, he begged now, his voice breaking. I didn't mean I cut him off, my voice steady as steel. You stopped being my son the moment you tried to poison me. The words hung between us like a gavel striking. Michael's face crumpled, rage and grief warring inside him. He slammed his fist against my desk, but the sound was weak, hollow. For the first time since he was a boy, I saw fear in his eyes, real fear. I gathered the papers, calmly sliding them back into my briefcase. This conversation is over, I said quietly. Michael hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue, to plead again. But there was nothing left to say. Shoulders hunched, he turned and walked out of my office, smaller than I had ever seen him. When the door shut behind him, I pulled out Margaret's pocket watch and wound it once more. The tick was steady. My heart was steady. The first blow had landed, and this time I wasn't the one reeling. The courthouse smelled of old wood and colder justice. As I pushed open the heavy double doors, the air shifted. Conversations dropped into whispers. Heads turned, eyes followed me as I walked toward the front. Some people saw a frail widower in a worn suit. Let them. They would soon see otherwise. Michael sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders stiff, his tie crooked, despite Sophia's careful hands. He looked younger somehow, smaller, like a boy waiting for punishment. Sophia sat beside him, her posture flawless, her lipstick bright, her gaze fixed forward. For a moment, she didn't even glance my way. I wondered if it was shame or simply strategy. The judge, silver-haired and stern, entered with the authority of a hammer striking steel. Court is now in session. The bailiff's voice rang out, and silence blanketed the chamber. The district attorney rose, her file thick with the weight of truth. Your Honor, she began the state charges Michael Bennett with attempted fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud his father of property and assets. Today we will show not just intent, but action. Her words cut clean, every syllable sharp. She laid the foundation first, the power of attorney documents prepared in advance, forged signatures waiting for me. Then came the emails, printed copies, projected on the screen for everyone to see. Words I had read late at night in my garage now filled the courtroom. Sophia's name was there. Michael's name was there, phrases like sedatives, timing, and once he signs, it's over. Richard Coleman sat beside me, his jaw tight as stone. He whispered, they can't talk their way out of this. I gripped Margaret's pocket watch in my vest pocket, feeling its steady tick. The prosecution brought out the pharmacy records next. A prescription for a sedative written under a false name purchased by Sophia, but linked back to Michael's credit card. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I watched Michael's face pale, his lips tightening into a line. He clenched his fists under the table, knuckles white. Then the prosecutor called the first witness. The state calls Elena Morales. Gasps rippled again. Michael's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide. Sophia froze, her smile cracking. Elena walked to the witness stand with trembling hands, but when she raised them to swear the oath, her voice was steady. She told them everything. How she had overheard the whispers in the kitchen, how she had seen the papers laid out on the mahogany desk, how she had been ordered to leave the room whenever sensitive conversations began. Her words spilled out like water breaking through a dam, quiet at first, then unstoppable. The defense attorney pounced, sneering. Miss Morales, aren't you simply a disgruntled employee? Perhaps bitter at being dismissed, Elena lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. Dismissed? No. I quit. I quit because I would not watch them destroy a man who never deserved it. She glanced at me briefly, and I gave her the smallest nod. The courtroom murmured again, and the defense lawyer faltered. But the true twist came next. To my surprise, Sophia herself stood whispering to her lawyer, who shook his head frantically. She ignored him. Your Honor, she said, her voice smooth as glass. I wish to cooperate with the state. The room erupted in whispers. Michael whipped around, his face twisted in shock. What are you doing? He hissed, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Sophia's expression didn't change. Calmly, she produced folders, bank records, wire transfers, correspondence. I have proof, she said evenly. Proof that Michael orchestrated everything. I was pressured, misled. Michael roared, his voice breaking. You liar! You were part of it! You pushed me! He slammed his fist on the table, but the judge's gavel cracked down. Order Sophia didn't even look at him. She kept her gaze on the judge, her performance flawless. I am willing to surrender this evidence in exchange for leniency. The district attorney pounced, taking the files, scanning the details, presenting them to the jury. Bank transfers from Michael's accounts. Emails begging shadowy lenders for more time. Even a recorded voicemail where he admitted he was desperate, where he begged for mercy. The evidence piled higher and higher until Michael's outbursts sounded like nothing more than the cries of a drowning man. He shouted about loyalty, about family, about betrayal, but each word only painted him smaller, weaker, more exposed. At last, the jury filed back in. Their deliberation had been short, an hour at most. The foreman stood, his voice steady. On the charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, we find the defendant, Michael Bennett, guilty. The word guilty echoed through the chamber, like a bell tolling the end of an era. Michael's face collapsed, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. He turned to me, desperation breaking him down to the boy I once knew. Dad, please. You can't let them do this. I'm your son. I met his gaze, calmly, unflinching. You stopped being my son the moment you tried to poison me. His scream tore through the courtroom as the bailiffs cuffed him, dragging him away. Sophia sat stone-faced beside her lawyer, already negotiating her escape. The judge's gavel struck once more. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel still echoed in my ears as the bailiffs closed in on Michael. His face twisted, torn between rage and desperation. The clink of the cuffs locking around his wrist was louder than it should have been, sharp enough to cut through every memory I had of him as a boy. Dad, he shouted, his voice cracking like it had when he was 12 and caught in a lie. Please don't let them do this. I'm your son. I didn't move. I didn't answer. The words I had spoken a moment earlier still hung in the air, heavy as stone. You stopped being my son the moment you tried to poison me. Michael fought against the bailiffs as they pulled him toward the door, his voice growing shrill, raw. He called my name again and again, but each time it sounded less like a plea and more like a curse. By the time the door slammed shut behind him, the courtroom was silent. Sophia remained at the defense table, perfectly composed, already leaning in toward the prosecutors. Her lips moved with calculated precision, offering details, promising cooperation. She had betrayed her husband with the same elegance she had once used to pour wine. I watched her red lipstick curve around words like agreement and leniency, and I realized she was already carving a future for herself without Michael. There was no grief in her eyes, no shame, only survival. When I stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the flashbulbs were blinding. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust toward my face. Mr. Bennett, how do you feel about your son's conviction? Do you believe Sophia was also guilty? What will happen to the Bennett garages now? I kept walking, saying nothing. Some truths didn't need repeating. They stood on their own. By the next morning, every paper and every local channel carried the same headline, "Local businessman exposed in family fraud scandal." The story spread like wildfire. People I had known for years, neighbors, customers, old friends, now looked at me differently. At the grocery store, Mrs. Turner from down the street touched my arm gently. Arthur, she whispered, her eyes heavy with pity. I'm so sorry. No father should have to go through that. I managed a small nod. Behind her, another man I barely knew gave me a firm pat on the shoulder. Took guts to stand your ground, he said. Most men would have folded. Their words carried weight, some soft with compassion, others firm with respect. And I realized then that pity and admiration could live side by side, both born from the same wound. The garages became my refuge in the days that followed. The smell of motor oil, the hum of old engines, the familiar chatter of workers, it grounded me, reminded me that I still had something worth protecting. One afternoon, as I sat in my small office flipping through stacks of papers, there was a knock on the door. It was Daniel Ruiz, one of my former apprentices. He had started under me as a teenager, eager but clumsy, and now ran his own small shop across town. He stepped inside, taller than I remembered, his face lined with years of work, but his eyes still carried that same spark of loyalty. Mr. Bennett, he said, pulling a folder from his jacket, I thought you'd want this. I opened it slowly. Inside were the official documents signed and stamped, proving beyond question that the garages were mine again, untouched, unclaimed, safe. My throat tightened as I ran my fingers over the embossed seals, the cool paper grounding me. "They're yours, sir," Daniel said softly. "No disputes left. You're clear." For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. "Thank you, Daniel," I said quietly. He shrugged, but his voice was firm. "You taught me everything I know. I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from you." After he left, I sat alone in the office, the folder open before me, Margaret's pocket watch ticking in my vest pocket. Outside, the garage buzzed with life customers, arriving workers, laughing engines rumbling. The world moved on, steady and relentless. But for me, something had shifted. The betrayal had been dragged into the light, the evidence secured, the legacy preserved. Michael was gone, locked away. Sophia was bargaining for freedom, and I, though scarred, was still standing. Several days passed after the trial, each one moving slower than the last. The world outside seemed to return to its routines, neighbors mowing lawns, engines humming at the garages, children riding their bikes down cracked sidewalks. Yet inside my house, silence stretched long and heavy, filled only by the ticking of Margaret's pocket watch on the mantel. It was in that silence that the letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting uneven but unmistakable. Michael's. For a long moment, I just stared at it resting on my kitchen table, the paper stark against the worn wood. Part of me wanted to tear it apart without reading to deny him even the dignity of being heard. But another part, the part that still remembered him as a boy grinning proudly with grease on his hands, compelled me to open it. The letter began clumsily, as though each word weighed more than he could bear to write. "Dad, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. I don't even know if I deserve to call myself your son anymore." His handwriting trembled across the page, ink blotched in places as though he had paused too long, unsure whether to continue. He confessed it all, the hunger for success, the shortcuts, the lies he told himself to justify the path he'd taken. He wrote about Sophia, how he let her ambition fuel his own greed, how he convinced himself that stealing from me was somehow his birthright. "I thought I was entitled to what you built, Dad. I told myself it was just moving things forward. But the truth is, I was impatient and I was selfish, and I paid the price. There was no attempt to shift blame. Not anymore. Sophia's name barely appeared except as a passing shadow. Michael placed the weight squarely on his own shoulders. He admitted the poisoned drink, the forged documents, the desperation in every move he made. I thought I was being clever, but all I was doing was destroying myself. And in the process, I nearly destroyed you too. By the time I reached the final page, my throat was tight. He ended with words I never expected to see from him. If there is anything left in me worth saving, it's because of you. I don't ask for another chance, I don't deserve it. I only ask that someday you remember the boy I used to be, before greed turned me into this. Your son, Michael." I sat there for a long while, the letter trembling in my hands. I could still hear his voice shouting in the courtroom, still see the fury in his eyes as he was dragged away in chains. But this voice, the one written in ink on paper, was different. It was smaller, broken, stripped of performance. It was the voice of a man who finally saw the ruins he had built with his own hands. I folded the letter carefully, smoothing its creases with the same tenderness Margaret once used when folding Michael's childhood clothes. My eyes drifted to the old Bible on the shelf, its leather cover cracked, its pages still marked with pressed flowers Margaret had saved decades ago. She had always said that forgiveness was less about others and more about ourselves. "Arthur," she once told me, "forgiveness frees the one who gives it, not always the one who receives it." I slipped the letter between the pages, letting it rest among Margaret's flowers. Forgiveness, I realized then, wasn't for Michael. It wasn't to erase what he'd done or to absolve him of the choices that had shattered our family. Forgiveness was for me, for the weight I had carried, for the anger that threatened to harden into stone. As the letter disappeared into the Bible, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace, not yet, but release. I no longer needed to answer Michael's plea. I no longer needed to carry his betrayal like a brand on my chest. I had survived it, and by setting the letter aside, I let it belong to the past where it belonged. The pocket watch ticked steadily from the mantel, marking the moment. Margaret's presence lingered in the silence, her wisdom guiding me still. And for the first time in months, I breathed without the tightness in my chest. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing. It meant choosing not to let anger chain me the way greed had chained Michael. And that choice, I realized, was the one thing they could never steal from me. The winter air was crisp as I stood by Margaret's grave, the earth frozen beneath my shoes, the sky a pale wash of gray. In my hands rested a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. I knelt slowly, brushing the stone clean before laying the flowers gently at its base. For a long moment I said nothing, letting the silence wrap around me. Then I whispered, "I always thought revenge would be loud, Margaret. I thought it would come with fire, with shouting, with fury. But it isn't. It's quiet, steady, like breathing again after holding it too long." A gust of wind stirred, rattling the bare branches above, and I felt her presence there, soft, steady, unshaken. For the first time since she left, I wasn't weighed down by anger. I wasn't crushed beneath betrayal. I was simply standing alive, free. When I returned home, the house didn't feel empty anymore. I slipped Margaret's pocket watch from my vest and placed it carefully on the mantel. The steady tick, tick, tick filled the room. But it no longer reminded me of fear or of the nights when I thought I was one step away from ruin. Now it marked freedom. Every beat was a step away from bitterness, a step toward peace. I looked around at the photographs lining the shelves, at the tools I had once used to build a life from nothing, and I realized that true revenge isn't about destruction. It isn't about seeing others fall. It's about refusing to be destroyed yourself. It's about reclaiming dignity when others try to take it. Sometimes the greatest revenge is silence, the silence of a man who walks forward free. And as I sat there in that stillness, I understood Michael's downfall was his own doing. Sophia's escape was temporary, but my survival, that was permanent. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, if you've ever wondered how to rise when the people closest to you tried to pull you down, then I hope my story reminds you strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Before you leave, I want you to reflect, what would you have done if you were in my place? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, don't just scroll away. Save this video, share it, and subscribe now, because more stories like this one are waiting and you don't want to miss them.